Hello, Professor Ellis.
Hello, Professor Coy.
We continue our conversation on the 30th anniversary of your book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People on its 30th anniversary. So this chapter will be on the tradition of dissent, and it's going to be a very intense chapter. So let's begin. The tradition of dissent basically represents the anti-Zionists and the non-Zionist movements within the debate over the state of Israel. The terminology first. What's the difference between Jewish nationalism, anti-Zionism, and non-Zionism?
Well, the definitions of them change within the historical context that obviously way back when, before there was the possibility of a state of Israel, it meant one thing. And as the state was coming into being, it meant another. And now that the state is here, it means another. So it's an evolving definition, but anti-Zionist Jews and non-Zionist Jews, in essence, believe that Jews should not have a nation state, that Jews should be a diaspora people, a justice-seeking people, a people wherever they are at home, and they should bond with others of like mind to pursue a better world. And it's also one way of defining Jewishness. And thinking back now that we're going through these conversations, remembering that when I wrote Beyond Innocence and Redemption, I wrote it very quickly and in the heat of battle during the Palestinian uprising. And I was piecing things together as I wrote. This was not a book that could be thought out in advance, or I could think out in advance. I gathered material from here and there and wrote it. Now, 30 years later, I'm reflecting on what I wrote in a somewhat different way and see different parts of it that I may have understood in a way, but now understand in another way. So this is part of a universalistic sense within Jewish life that Jews have something to contribute with others, but Jewish particularity is not to be overt or to be expressed religiously or within a state. There was a fear that nationalism, Jewish nationalism, would become like other nationalisms. In a sense, too, looking back, anti-Zionist and non-Zionist Jews were fighting against a kind of assimilation to state power, which they didn't really realize as Jewish because we hadn't had it for so long, but they saw it all around. And they didn't want to become like the other nations. So we're going back in Jewish history in a way too. So these are anti-nationalists in general, and especially when it comes to Jewish nationalism.
Okay. So let's begin with our discussion. Let me share this screen that I think would be very helpful, so that our, those who are viewing this video could follow our conversation. This is very exciting conversation, and we'll be looking at 4 individuals that you have mentioned in your book. And these are William Zukerman, Rabbi Elmer Berger, of course, Noam Chomsky, and Rabbi Jacob Neusner. And okay, so let's begin with the periodization that you have used in your book. So in looking at this tradition of dissent, you basically divided it into two periods. The first one, 30 years of internal conflict over Zionism. This is between 1937 and to 1967, which is the Israeli war, the Six-Day War, where Israel won the war. And then we have between 1967 to 1987, up to the Palestinian uprising, victory and occupation. So could you explain this periodization, Professor Ellis?
Well, of course, whenever you do a periodization, it's somewhat arbitrary. And remember last time, in the last chapter, we were discussing this conflict over Zionism with Judah Magnus and Hannah Arendt, a little bit of Martin Buber, and of course, Asher Ginsburg. So this is a continuation, but 1937 is when the Reform rabbis adopted what's called the Columbus Platform. And this goes back to Reform Judaism, historically being anti-nationalistic and certainly anti-Zionism, as Orthodox Jews were. And again, we're conflating and conflicting, but this is part of the sea change in Jewish life. Most Jews historically have been anti-state Zionism. But as the Nazi period began and anti-Semitism increased, there were concerns, obviously, about European Jews and what was happening to them and what could happen to Jews in general. And the question of nationalism in terms of settlements in Palestine, Jewish settlements in Palestine, was heightened. And in 1937, the Reform rabbis met and adopted the Columbus Platform, which was anti-state Zionism, but there was a shift, recognizing that many Jews were coming to Palestine and maybe others would have to, and that there was a renewal in Palestine that could be important. So there was a shift in the sense of diaspora. Reform Jews said, we're not a nation. The Bible is basically myth. We don't seek a return. We are wherever we are, and we should be prophetic wherever we are and accepted wherever we are. And this was somewhat of a shift because it recognized that the renewal of the Jewish community in Palestine could be important for Jews who needed it, but maybe also Jews outside Palestine. And then that therefore increased the conflict within Reform Judaism with those who were fighting any inroads. They saw this as a kind of an inroad of a nationalism. And this continued, again, with Magnus and Buber and Hannah Arendt and others, until the 1967 war. Again, things were moving toward a recognition of state Zionism. There was a conflict over it. But with the victory of 1967 by Israel and the threat that Jews felt Israel was under right before the war, and the development of Holocaust theology, which we've discussed, there was a sea change after the 67 war. So we can look at this conflict changing during the years 1937 to 1967, and then after that victory, where Holocaust consciousness, Holocaust theology, and Jewish nationalism, often not named as nationalism, but the state of Israel, became predominant. So these are two periods, and then we can look at another period, the uprising and beyond, which I do in later chapters. And in this chapter too, where I begin to talk about the uprising and the conflict that arises there within the Jewish community.
Okay.
So here we have a clash between a progressive interpretation of history, quite liberal and also beautiful in its own way, And the Holocaust, which ends European Jewry for all practical purposes, which is in a movement that is decidedly unliberal and unaccepting. So Berger believes that Jews will be completely accepted when everybody understands correctly how we should treat each other.
In a way, does he favor the diaspora, that Jews are better off in the diaspora rather than to have a Jewish homeland?
Yes, but diaspora is a little bit complicated too, because if you're in a diaspora, there might be a homeland.
Oh.
So Reform Jews, in a sense, don't believe in a diaspora because there is no homeland. The homeland is wherever we are. But it is obviously a form of diaspora Judaism, but it's taking it a step further. There's no desire to return. There are, in synagogue rules and regulations or mission statements, it's often directly stated that Jews are not a nation. We don't seek to return. We live where we live. Again, very progressive, very liberal, very American, and also, in my view, naive.
Yeah, so I was thinking this, actually this position resonates with Marx, Marx's idea or argument on the Jewish problem, that the best way for Jews to achieve equality will be to be fully assimilated in the society or where they are. So and many of the Reform rabbis, at least during this period, were also connected with socialist groups.
Well,
Is that correct?
we have the left wing of Jewish life, the internationalists. They're very much against Jewish particularity, even though in a way they're expressing it, of course, as Jews do. Berger, I don't recall him being a socialist or a Marxist. I don't think so. But he was a liberal Democrat who had a sense that, there were obstacles historically, but look at where we've come and look at where we're going. And we can assimilate and maintain our religiosity, but it's a religiosity which is hardly identifiable as Jewish. And some would identify it almost as Protestant. And again, that's another discussion. But I don't think Berger would see Marx as a Jewish hero. But I hear what you're saying. Reform Judaism in many ways is assimilationist because they want to participate in democracy as everyone else, but also retain a Jewish religiosity, which is good for Jews individually, but is not about a collective.
I see. Let's move to the next quote from Rabbi Elmer Berger's The Jewish Dilemma. And here he continued with the so-called Jewish problem, about which people are urgently concerned in working out the peace, has nothing to do, therefore, with the Jewish people. It has to do, at the very most, 5 million Jews, practically all of whom live in the vestigial feudalism of Central and Eastern Europe. Of these, we do not know how many will survive the Nazi policy of extermination. So he was here referring to the, as you said, the backwardness of Jews coming from Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, there's a whole history within these movements of seeing, and some of it's quite jarring now within the context of Holocaust theology. And American Jews are looking at Europe as, like Americans typically do, as a past. And a past we're getting away from because we're now in a free America, whereas in Europe you can't really be free. In general, there's a thought, and Jews are backward in Europe. We are enlightened, Berger would say, he says really directly. And the Holocaust, what's happening to Jews in Europe is partly because Europe is feudal. And Jews are caught up in it, and we don't know how many will survive. But if they come here and they become American, then they can be free. So there is a prejudice against European Jews, and Wiesel fights it. It's very interesting if you look at Wiesel in the 1950s. He's already in the United States, and he's complaining about the fact that Jews don't really want to recognize the victims of the Holocaust. And the underlying theme is Jews in America don't want to be confronted by European Jews. They want to leave that past behind because they believe that that's a feudal past, it's a backward past. It's a past where people can pick on Jews and discriminate against Jews, and those Jews are too Jewish in a way. Heschel also, by the way, experienced this when he came to the United States. We now honor him, but in the beginning, he landed in a Reform seminary, and the Reform Jews there thought he was from outer space, which is called Europe. And by the way, he also had a very negative view of American Judaism. So this is within Jewry, there's a lot of stuff about Jews from different parts of the world. And there's a hierarchy developed by others, by some over others and others over. So, but Rabbi Berger and others thought that America was the promised land and Europe was finished in general and for Jews too. And by the way, it was good it was finished. Not the way it was finished, but it was good that it was finished because it was backward.
Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting part of history, you know, that there was actually in a way not an animosity, or it could be an animosity between the American rabbis and the European rabbis. Okay.
Yeah, I'll tell you another story because I think it's interesting. When I gave one of my first lecture at Tantur outside of Jerusalem during the uprising, after I gave my talk, a man wanted to talk to me, a Jew who was in a wheelchair, so he couldn't come out, and I was brought back to meet him. And he said to me, you must be of German background. That is, the German Jews felt superior to the Polish Jews, the Eastern European Jews. And he thought I knew when he said that, he thought I was quite bright. He really liked my lecture. So I looked at him and I said, no, my background is Russian. So I knew when he said that he thought I had a German background, that he really thought I was quite bright, because German Jews felt that toward Eastern European Jews. And when I came back, I realized what he was saying. I said, no, I'm an Eastern European Jew.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, German Jews like Hannah Arendt, they
Huber too, they felt the superior Eastern European Jews, no question.
Okay, so let's move on, and this time we look at the thoughts of William Zukerman, who is not a rabbi, and but a very critical and a powerful writer and a reporter. And I think so. This is from Zukerman's Voice of Dissent, Jewish Problems, a collection of his essays between 1948 to 1961. And this was published in 1962. And you mentioned about, you just putting things together. And actually in the footnote, you said, I am grateful to Wes Avram, who introduced me to Zukerman and his Dissent. So as I said, you don't really know about these things, but you did your research and converse with other people, and then you took their lead in a way.
And people, if I might interrupt for a second, people started sending me this book, an edited book of his essays, Zukerman's essays, was sent to me by a Christian minister who had opposed Zionism, very pro-Jewish in his own way, but against Zionism. So after Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, which I pieced together solely by myself, people recognized my voice and began to contact me, not through the internet, still pre-internet, and send me books and send me sources. And this was one that was sent to me by a Christian minister who actually donated to me a whole library of his. He was older, that contained a lot of this literature.
Very, very interesting. Okay, so here's Zukerman. The point that is usually overlooked in reports that glorify Israel is the tragedy of Arab refugees. And he commented about how they were being treated. And he said that how can one remain indifferent in the face of such awful tragedy? Have we no conscience? What did we use to say to non-Jews who remained indifferent to similar tragedies of the Jews? So here he was referring to how the Arab refugees were being treated after the creation of the state of Israel, and he felt really disgusted with it, and he felt that this shouldn't be. This is not for him what Jewish what it means to be Jewish for Zukerman.
This is an argument about justice and injustice, but it's also an argument about what it means to be Jewish. Holocaust in Israel raised this question in a very explosive way. And Zukerman, who is interested in justice and very strong, as some other Jews are, while Holocaust consciousness is overwhelming that discussion. So here's a battle with the Jewish establishment and Jewish consciousness that's coming into being. And he's asking the question, can we be Jews and oppress others? And the answer we now know is yes, we can. But here, it's still up for grabs. He's saying, if we do this, we can't call ourselves Jews. And the Jewish establishment, originally anti and non-Zionist, which is becoming Zionist, says, not only can we do it, we're going to cover over what we're doing so we can do it. So there's already an anxiety in the Jewish establishment, pointed out by Zukerman and people like him, that are saying, you're basically saying we can be Jewish and unjust. I don't think so. And so he and others become branded not as having a different opinion, but as self-hating Jews. These people don't like being Jews. That's why they keep pointing this out. And it really isn't happening, is it? Because you don't know about it and we're going to keep it from you. But there's a clash here with the Jewish establishment, which is long running in different arenas, but now highlighted by Israel and state power and Arab refugees.
Yeah. And by 1967, after 1967, basically all of this, and he was actually the last of his generation that after 1961, basically, he died in 1961, and after that, no one has taken the Jewish newsletter, where he writes, basically was basically discontinued.
Yeah, this whole Jewish tradition of dissent, this part of it is closed down. It comes back again now. So the Jewish establishment hasn't been able to stamp it out, but most Jews who are dissenting now know nothing about this part of the tradition.
Oh, that's really unfortunate, because I think this is, as you said, they contain formidable power if they get in touch with this history I think they offer, and I mean the arguments. I've read uh, uh, those long quotes from Rabbi Elmer and Zukerman. They are all, they are, I think they represent the arguments that I think just can still be explored
Yes.
or revived until now.
But that's the job of tradition, isn't it? It closes down the real history, but also keeps part of it. It keeps coming back. So it's back now in a different way, but the Jews who dissent know nothing about it, or very little, if anything, and not really interested. It's a different time period now, and there's a different understanding of Jewishness, but you're right. As I came into contact with it, I said to myself, well, I am not alone. There's a history, and the reason I wrote about this as I gathered this information was to say there is a foundation for this dissent. Powers don't want us to know. It has to do with the Jewish prophetic identity now. There's a narrow foundation for the continuation of Jewish dissent in different periods, starting from the Bible up to today. But tradition basically closes that. It's almost like the 500th anniversary of the Christianity in the Philippines. How many Christians know resistance? Because the tradition now in the Philippines has said, close it down, celebrate the 500 years. Please, I don't hear anything negative.
I mean, and the thing is, historians were for that, but there are always arguments that that's the past, and Christianity has been renewed, with liberation theology, and especially after the in reality, not assume, that past. And in a way, that's really not that's service history to tradition.
The difference in ethnicities, our indigenous is the within Filipino history, other histories, but for it's the indigenous. So no matter how you try to keep it down, you have to create ideologies that discipline, and yet it is very time. So the example is and has turned very short the Holocaust consciousness, the establishment was stamped out forever.
Another book of your other book, Find a Voice, very persists. Read the book, book 2018, Find a Voice. And like Berger, there is but here Zukerman is already including saying these are two different.
I think he's more Berger is we would have to delve into their lives and their biographies. And I was piecing this together, but there are differences in the way they speak and their general orientation, although both are anti-nationalist in a Jewish sense. And Zukerman is stronger in his comments, but Berger travels to the Arab countries and all, so he moves around in circles which are considered by the Jewish establishment as time goes on as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. So they're both quite courageous in their own way. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it's important to know or to note that this tradition lives on in someone like Bernie Sanders. He comes from this same non-nationalist tradition. And basically, although he accepts Israel and he supports Israel,
but this supposed to say that.
Sanders is the last political figure and the most prominent political figure in American history, Jewish, that comes out of parts of these traditions. And Sanders' crusade against injustice, in my view, is a crusade against that final assimilation. Now, he doesn't talk about his Jewishness, except when he's forced to. He doesn't have a great sense of it in terms of articulating, again, like Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, which is our next dissident. Chomsky, and basically, you said that by 1983, Chomsky is the prime carrier of the tradition of dissent between the miracle of 1967 and the horror of the Sabra and Shatila massacre. So he was the prominent voice of dissent between this second period that you were talking about, from 1967 to 1987. And This is from your book. Uh, well, you're commenting on Chomsky's views about the conflict between Palestinian and Jewish claims, and and let me read this. For Chomsky, the conflict between these claims, Palestinian and Jewish claims, is obvious, especially when raised to the level of demand for survival. Each side sees itself as a genuine national liberation movement. To the Israelis, the 1948 war is the war of liberation. To the Palestinians, it is the war of conquest. This formulation leads to unresolvable conflict. Anyway, by the way, I remember you describing Chomsky as basically a homeland Zionist. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think Chomsky is fascinating in so many ways and an iconic figure. Um, he comes out of this Jewish tradition, which is non-nationalist and non-Zionist. I would call him a homeland Zionist. He doesn't write much about it now. He did previously some. And he's an American exceptionalist, my own view, and an American patriot, which he doesn't articulate either. And Chomsky doesn't articulate his Jewishness at all. And it's impossible to understand him without it. It's sort of like Bob Dylan. These are universalists who are so Jewish in their universalism that it's quite a hoot in many ways. And I love to listen to Chomsky because it's so Jewish, and of course Dylan too. And Chomsky is looking for a way through. He doesn't deny the Jewish attachment to the land. He doesn't discuss it much either. There are Jews there in great numbers now, and there are Palestinians. And the Palestinians have been hurt and injustice, no question. We need to find a way. But again, Chomsky is this final assimilation to injustice is impossible for Jews, although he never articulates it Jewishly. And in fact, his argument is quite Jewish. And a Jew in America. Chomsky is not very deep on questions of Europe. It's all about America. Everything in the world that's wrong is America. And also, he's an American exceptionalist. We're free in America to make decisions. In my view, most of the parts of the world, including Europe, exist for Chomsky just as an extension of American foreign policy. It's quite Jewish in the American phase, and he's free in America to express this, whereas in other parts of the world, he wouldn't be. And as a Jew, he lives freely and mingles with everyone. But if you don't understand his Jewishness, you don't understand Chomsky.
Well, the only time that I think he referred, he was quite overt in being Jewish was, I remember this interview he was speaking at the UN, and then he was asked about, something to the being a self-hating Jew or what, and then, and interestingly, I mean, it was quite unexpected. He talks about the prophets in the Bible and how the prophets in the Bible were called haters of Israel.
Yeah. Well, he's had to, so interesting with Sanders too, or with Dylan and Chomsky. These are people who can talk up and sing about everything, and everybody in the world can understand them. But when you ask them about their Jewishness, they come up short. It's very hard for them to talk about it, and yet that inability to talk and articulate about their Jewishness and this idea of promise in the Bible, Chomsky's been asked so much, so he's had to come up with a response because people ask him. But when it comes to Jewishness, these great articulators of everything, they're sort of like a pause and a blank. And yet that is also, from this part of the tradition, so Jewish.
Yeah, in a way, that's you talk about idolatry as that maybe for them that's being talking about too much about your Jewishness could could be a kind
Well,
of idolatry too.
yeah, and maybe I think it's fascinating because whenever I listen to them, I'm thinking Jewish, 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 Jewish.
Okay, all right. Let's go to another of Professor Chomsky's Jewishness. And this is from his famous book, The Fateful Triangle, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians. And here he was talking about rejectionism, how the United States uh, uh, rejecting Arab claims, and yet that this term doesn't apply to Arabs, but everyone that says that Israel has no claim to the land is basically anti-Semite. So here he said something about rejectionism. Unless we adopt a racist assumption that Jews have certain intrinsic rights that Arabs lack, the term rejectionism should be extended beyond its standard usage to include also the position of those who deny the rights of national self-determination to Palestinian Arabs. The community that constituted 9/10 of the population at the time of the First World War, when Great Britain committed itself to the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. And here he was talking about the inequality, the unequal treatment between Jews and Arabs. It's more of an expression of racism.
Yes, and again, this is to me a very Jewish perspective on the situation, and correct in many ways. Accusing those who deny Palestinians of a racism, which again has American reference in terms of white and black.
Mhm.
And Chomsky is not one to push Jews into the sea or to destroy Israel or anything like that. It's to reach some kind of accommodation where Jews and Palestinians can live together. Chomsky is not naive about American liberal democracy. Berger and others might have been more liberal on that, more naive on that. So he's not naive on that, but he argues that the United States should sponsor a reconciliation between Jews and Palestinians in Israel-Palestine, and mostly blames the United States for the inability of that to happen. So Chomsky is very, very strong in certain parts of this critique, and then has been outflanked on the left in other parts now, but he's revered as properly so as an icon, what I would consider a Jewish and American exceptionalist.
Yeah, and here, I mean, in this argument, is it correct to read it as he favors American interventionism?
Well, there have been Jews in this line of dissent which have favored American intervention, military intervention, certainly policy intervention as well. Judah Magnus, when he argued with Secretary of State Marshall and President Harry Truman, asked them to create a trusteeship of Palestine, the way the British had it, which would have probably meant the introduction of American military troops in Jerusalem to keep Palestine together. So there is some history of accepting American military intervention to solve the issue and bring justice for Palestinians, or at least some justice, and even against Israel. Whether Chomsky has specifically said that, I don't know. I doubt that he would talk about American military intervention. But my point is America intervenes militarily all over the world. It's a little interesting that it hasn't Now, it has, in a way, on behalf of Israel, with its American military support. So there's a lot of military intervention on the American side for Israel, but the introduction of troops is another issue. And you have to be serious about it if you're going to argue for justice. If America is in fact holding it back, could America promote it? And the way America has been, quote, promoting it is through the endless peace process, which isn't really promoting it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to bring up, because there's also now a move to condition military aid to Israel, and in a way that's also acknowledging that it is through this military intervention by way of defunding or conditioning military aid that that there's a possible move forward.
So, which I write about in Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, because there were movements in the 1980s and 90s, and now even today, but very vocal in the 80s, during the uprising especially, to condition American military aid to Israel on its Israel's human rights or violation thereof. But that was confronted by the progressive Jewish groups like Michael Lerner and Arthur Waskow. I was in meetings with them about this, and they were very much against that in different ways. So that's also a conflict on the American left about what do you do with Israel's permanent violation of Palestinian rights? How far do you go? What do you suggest? They go strategically. We have to talk to the Jewish community, get them on board. And then when someone brings up this question of aid to Israel, then that's another level. Some support it, some don't. Some try to block it, some try to encourage it. So that's another continuing conflict within the Jewish left. And whenever it's brought up, the Jewish establishment, of course, considers that anti-Jewish.
Okay. And here, and then in the last part of your book, when you were talking about Chomsky, he wrote a very long critique about the massacre of Palestinian refugees. So here, like Zukerman, he was appalled by what was happening. But here, there's more. This is not just dispossession of land or the eviction of Palestinians from their homes, but massacres. Like in the context of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and he was talking about the tragic massacre of Palestinian refugees in Sabra and Shatila, and for him this is really unacceptable.
Yes, and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is part of the unraveling of Holocaust theology, which will lead up to the Jewish uprising during the Palestinian uprising in 1987, 88, 89, and 90. So a lot of this was hidden from ordinary Jews, certainly hidden from people like me going through Hebrew school and in the media. But by the 1980s, the celebration of the 67 war, the victory in the 67 war, was beginning to wear thin. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem, which happened after the 67 war, is now looking like it's extending. It's not going to be ended. It may even become permanent. And the invasion of Lebanon hits the media and hits Jews. And so this is part of the tradition of dissent, which is now going to get into a new gear or another gear. Once the state of Israel has established itself and is no longer fighting for its existence from the Jewish perspective, but is now actively engaging in wars which have nothing to do with defense. Even if the other wars didn't have to do with defense, it was defined as such by much of the Jewish establishment. So we needed to be unified. But now is becoming clear, including for Israelis who refused to serve in Lebanon, saw that as an extension, not a defense, but an offense. And Chomsky is becoming more prominent and more vocal during this time as the exemplar of the tradition of Jewish dissent within the empowerment of Israel. In the beginning, 1937, through the 40s, through the 50s, you have, even into the 60s, you have Israel becoming a state, establishing itself and all of that. Now we have Israel as an empowered state that is using its power to oppress. That's becoming obvious. And Chomsky is becoming more prominent, more vocal, and his understanding of what happened in Lebanon and much more popular in parts of the Jewish world and, of course, across the world. So now we have a Jewish voice like Dylan in a very different way, or maybe a similar way, that's becoming universally acclaimed for his dissent on Chomsky's side, dissent of American power, abuse of American power, and abuse of Israeli power.
And although Chomsky was probably the most vocal or the prime carrier of that dissent, there were others. Then you mentioned here in your book, Robert Strauss Feuerlich's book, The Fate of the Jews, a people torn between Israeli power and Jewish ethics. And then there's also Earl Shorey's Jews Without Mercy, a Lament. And then Jacob Timmerman's The Longest War. They all discuss the different views that Chomsky emphasizes. And basically, they all agreed that Jews are no longer innocent.
Yes, the Lebanon War was, you have these events which become more than the event itself. You have these platforms, you have the Holocaust, you have the establishment of the State of Israel, you have the 67 war, you have Lebanon. These become, there are certain flashpoints where people become aware, where people change, and where people no longer dissent, and then where people dissent. You have the Eichmann trial. So Lebanon becomes a point of where the 67 war, seen as a miracle victory by many Jews, including, of course, Elie Wiesel, it begins to be unravel. And Holocaust theology is now going to be put on its heels and quickly, in effect, come to an end in the Palestinian uprising. It continues, of course, but these are flashpoints which we can look back at and say, yeah, the Lebanon War was a flashpoint of Jewish dissent. And there have been other events which have been flashpoints. And then the Palestinian uprising in late 87, 88, 89. And then now today. So this is formative, and are a lot of voices, including within Israel. And this is, these Israeli voices are now becoming known. And Chomsky, who was known before this, especially for his anti-Vietnam position, now is becoming known in another way on the Jewish front. The voices that were disciplined by Holocaust consciousness and Holocaust theology, that's beginning to be fought. And of course, Holocaust theology is going to try to clamp down on that. But in the end, it loses the narrative war. So by 1982, and then the Palestinian uprising, there's going to be very little discussion, even by the Jewish establishment, of Jewish innocence. And there's going to be less and less discussion, even by the Jewish establishment, of Israel being redemptive. It's a very short window where it's seen Israel as innocent and redemptive, but a very powerful window. And then that window is going to be smashed. And the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is part of that unraveling.
Yeah, that was a defining moment.
It's a,
Okay, before we leave Professor Chomsky, I just have this one question because Professor Chomsky was vilified because of his positions of on Israel Palestine, and he was he was hit hard, but somehow he was protected, at least protected from the Jewish establishment. He in relation to you. He was protected, and why is it that he wasn't really hit hard by the Jewish establishment?
well, I think this is important. Chomsky never argues from the Jewish tradition, even though everything's about the Jewish tradition. He never articulates the Jewish tradition as the place that he comes out of. My work, of course, he's famous and he becomes iconic, and there's no question about his influence, especially as related to my lack of influence. But the argument from tradition is more dangerous because everybody knows it.
Mm-hmm.
When I started speaking in a Jewish theology of liberation and during the Palestinian uprising, everyone recognized what I was talking about. Chomsky's talking about American foreign policy mostly, which certainly on the left they recognize, but that is a kind of an internationalist perspective. Anyone who has that perspective can say, that's right. But where's the challenge to Jewishness? He actually is challenging Jewishness, but he doesn't articulate it. The question is always, what does it mean to be Jewish? And again, reflecting on these conversations we're having 30 years later, I realize in a deeper way that all of these people that we're talking about as dissenters are really arguing the question, what does it mean to be Jewish? I did it directly. Now, that doesn't mean I was more influential than Chomsky, not even 1,000th of an influence. But it's much more dangerous. And this is what's dangerous about the disappearance of that argument. Even today, the secular or diaspora argument lacks the strength of the indigenous prophetic argument. And that's what I argue. Now, all of them have lost, including mine. So that's not the issue of which one is more strategic. But to me, it's much more powerful, the question, which started way back in the Bible. It's the same question. What does it mean to be Jewish? That's the question that I'm asking in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. That's the question that Chomsky is asking, but he rarely, if ever, articulates it as such. It would be, in his mind, it would be a diminishment. He doesn't know how to articulate. You think Chomsky is brilliant, so this is not the question. So you ask, why can't he articulate that even strategically? Because he comes from the part of the Jewish tradition that says it's not appropriate. It's not in his cupboard of arguments, even though Chomsky seems to have an argument about everything. When it comes to Jewishness, essentially it's blank, which is fascinating and so Jewish.
Yes, it's really fascinating. Okay, let's go to the last figure in this tradition of dissent, Jacob Neusner, and he's a rabbi, and these are two quotes from his what he has written in the International Herald Tribune. And the first one was on the real promised land is America. Okay? And he says, it is time to say that America is a better place to be a Jew than Jerusalem. If ever there was a promised land, Jewish Americans are living in it. In the United States, Jews have flourished, not alone in politics and the economy, but in matters of art, culture, and learning. Jews feel safe and secure in ways that they do not and cannot in the state of Israel. So here it's an argument about the state of Israel as, not really the promised land. The promised land is in the United States, and Jews who would want to would like to enjoy the freedom and security are better off in America than in Israel.
Yes, this is another argument that is within this context and is often not expressed now. But Jewish Americans in general don't feel at home in Israel, and many Jews who have gone to Israel, first of all, a small percentage have gone to live in Israel. A high percentage of them return to America. So here's the question of, we're supposed to feel that Israel is our homeland, so why don't all Jews go, including a lot of American Zionists who never seem to go to live there, but who have this romantic imagination regarding Israel, and some who do go to live there leave, and some who have gone there to live have become the greatest dissidents against Israeli power. So America is quite complicated, but Neusner is saying something that is in many ways true. And there's been a transformation now that I've seen in my lifetime, where the idea was that Jews weren't really Jews in America, they could only be Jews in Israel. And many Israeli Jews not only are leaving Israel, but look to American Jews for sustenance. Neusner is being quite matter of fact about this. And in many ways, of course, it's true. And this is something that I think Jewish dissidents often don't argue anymore, but simply accept that their freedom in America and their acceptance in general is unique. And in fact, there are very few places in the world where Jews in great numbers can live. This is never discussed. Jews, I don't mean individual Jews or a small Jewish community, but millions of Jews. In what parts of the world are millions of Jews accepted by the society? Germans often say, oh, I'd love to have a Jewish population here, and there is mostly Russian now. But if when I say, well, we'll put 3 million Jews in the middle of Germany, I don't think so, or Austria or Poland. So Neusner is saying something that most Jews don't talk about on the left, that America has been a haven for Jews. Now, there are all sorts of complications, but in this sense, he's right.
Yes. And of course, it is in America that Jews have become empowered.
Well, that's the other part of it, which has also helped with Israeli empowerment. The idea that the state Zionists had was that all Jews would come to Israel. Well, of course, that's not happening, and that has never happened and will never happen. And Israel is partly a state and an empowered state because of American Jews in America, which have become mobilized for Israel's support, as Hannah Arendt predicted. Complicated relationship, but a very, very high percentage of Jews are concentrated in America and Israel. And in both of those places, as a collective, Jews are empowered. This is a sea change in Jewish history, unparalleled in Jewish history, at least the last 2,000 years of it.
Okay. Let's go to this is another quote from another article in the Tribune entitled, "It isn't light to the Gentiles or even bright for most Jews." And here he was again questioning about, is it really more ideal to live in Israel, to be a Jew in Israel than in the US. So much for being a Jew in the state of Israel. Here in the diaspora, we can be what we want, when we want, from nothing to everything, all the time or once in a while. Freedom is nice too. And the United States really has become a free country for us Jews. For American Jews, Jewish Americans, the American dream has come true. I wonder how many Israelis think that Zionist one has come true too. So here he was questioning, whether all this the promises of Zionism has been realized, or it is actually or as you said, it has become a nightmare.
Yeah. Well, this is also 1987, so think about it now, where it's much worse in many ways for Jews in Israel, or much more conflictive, and more Jews leaving Israel. And so this is an argument which few people want to make, and few people, even on the Jewish left now, admit that living in the American empire has been good for Jews in terms of what Neusner is saying, but it's also a conflict, as Chomsky points out as well. But as you pointed out, Chomsky's done very well in America, which is also true. So this is another classic case of what does it mean to be Jewish wherever you are, but Israel has highlighted that issue, and the Holocaust as well, and the concentration of Jews within two empires, one run by Jews in Israel and one where Jewish empowerment in America. And then the critique from the left about American power, what it's doing in the world, and Jews are caught. What do you do? If America is a haven for Jews, which it is, and then you're accused by others who are out in America or on the outs as being white privilege, and not arguing about you being Jews, at least directly, but perhaps having ambivalent view of Jews. Yeah, it's very difficult for Jews to speak the truth, the different parts of the truth, in public, and very difficult for them to think. This is what's naive about the Jewish left now, in my view, is that they don't admit that that America is a haven for Jews, and they don't admit that it isn't only about white privilege, that being Jewish is different, and that in Europe Jews weren't considered white or European by many. That's the Holocaust, which wasn't just German. It was there were a lot of folks in Europe that participated in it willingly, some unwillingly. So Jews are still in a tangle. There's still a Jewish question. The Jewish question is always changing.
What is the Jewish question now, Professor Ellis?
That's an interesting question. I have to think about it, but it's admitting, number one, that there is ambivalence about Jews around the world, carried mostly by Christianity and Islam, and also wherever that and in modernity, and that Jews need to be empowered. What does that empowerment entail? The idea of going back to an Elmer Berger understanding of Jewishness after the Holocaust in Israel is wrong, in my view. And Chomsky's critique of America, much of it's right, but it concentrates too much on America, and the globe becomes an American playing field. And there's a reason that he is free to dissent as a Jew, even though he never mentions, or very rarely mentions, his Jewishness. So there's a naivete that Jews have to move in the world, but there also needs to be a deeper reckoning that for Jews, in my view, that we haven't had.
Okay, thank you. This is in my view, the Jewish question is really about power. What do you do without power? As a Filipino, of course, that is, we never had power. So, as a Filipino looking at Jewish people and hoping, wishing that we too would have power, to also flourish culturally, economically, that would be good. But also, as it's being represented to us, that there's another side of it. Of course, it is so unimaginable for me for Filipinos to become conquerors. it's just it's just unimaginable. But who knows? Okay, okay. So this is your basically wraps up the that section about the two periods in the dissent against the state Zionism. And here I would like to quote from your book. If the early dissenters were idealists whose vision was overcome by Palestinian Arab intransigence and violence, as many claim today, they saw themselves as practical observers trying to implement that vision. In their collective wisdom, the Jewish people could not sustain or over the long run sponsor a revival of Jewish culture and spirituality built on the oppression of others. So we talk about since from Ginsburg to Buber to Hannah Arendt to Magnus, and and now with Zukerman, Berger, Chomsky, and Neusner. Um, they recognized Palestinian rights within a strategic framework, as some do today. And beyond that recognition, they saw the possibility of peace with justice in the land. So here, basically, especially with these four dissenters that we talk about, that the fate of the Jewish people is now inseparable from the Palestinians. And then to continue, the dissent that emerged at the time of the Lebanon War brings many themes of the pre-1967 critique forward, even as it reaches a new level of strength and outrage. It is as if the dream of an empowered Israel has been fulfilled and turned into a nightmare. If Israel's other wars could be justified in terms of national defense, Lebanon could not. At the same time, it had become clear that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was hardly a temporary reality, but more and more an integral part of the daily ideological substance of Israeli life. By 1983, it could be stated unequivocally by dissenters that Israel, far from being innocent and beleaguered, was now an aggressor and a conqueror. The dire predictions of the early dissenters in Zion had been realized. So that ends the section on the tradition of dissent, and the next part would be on the Jewish responses to the Palestinian uprising. Now I just read that last paragraphs, and maybe you could explain it more, Professor Ellis, about what the significance of that tradition of dissent, especially now. It's especially its relevance for today.
Yeah, the tradition of dissent, as we've been going through it, and as I discovered it while writing the book, in the heat of battle, as you say, people even sending me information, and again, without the internet, without Google, I realized that that was a narrative framework that I was standing within. And then I had to ask the question, how do I stand within that narrative framework of tradition of dissent? Where do I stand, and where should we stand at this point, not in the time of the Nazi period, not in the time of the formation of the state, not right after the state, not in the 1950s and 60s, but after this, not in the 67 war, not before the occupation of the East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, but now as the occupation becomes permanent and as Israel is empowered as a state, what do we say and how can we say it? And is it the same as Elmer Berger and Zukerman and Magnus and Hannah Arendt? Or is it different? And what are the similarities? What are the differences? And even Chomsky, could Chomsky begin today the way he is? Or was that also time-bound? His own start on this. And not that he's irrelevant now, but we all, people, even Catholics ask me about Dorothy Day, whom I knew. Should I become like her? Well, you can't become like her. She started at a certain time within a certain framework. And the question is, what can you take from her and become who you are? How does that help you? But your own voice is going to be somewhat different, or maybe a lot different. And I'm one that believes that Holocaust theology was essentially right, that the Holocaust was an overpowering event. It was a formative event in Jewish life. And it isn't, the world was different after that and is different after that. And Jews need to be empowered. And Jews have done something wrong to Palestinians and continue to do. So I'm not one to believe, I am not a diaspora Jew. And I don't believe in a renewal of diaspora Judaism. What does that mean? After the Holocaust and after the permanent occupation of Palestinians, what does the statement, I am not a diaspora Jew, mean? And what does the statement, Jews need to be empowered? Because there's so much ambivalence about Jews. Or even my statement that Jews in great numbers, I mean by the millions, cannot live in Europe. There isn't a country that would accept 3 or 4 or 5 million Jews. Now, these are very controversial statements which often aren't really thought of. But when you have this sense that the Holocaust did overpower the framework that Elmer Berger had, for instance, that Elmer Berger's witness was a witness. I honor that witness, but it's not my witness. And that the fight of Jewish dissent is within the context of the Holocaust and the state of Israel, which is permanent, and its occupation of Palestinians, which is permanent. So that we're not innocent, and Israel is not redemptive, but Israel will remain. And American Jews are white and they're not white. Well, we live in a world that isn't anti-Semitic, but has deep ambivalence about Jews and Jewish empowerment. And we do need protection, but what does that mean? And Noam Chomsky isn't available to us, and Bernie Sanders, although politically was available, his tradition is over. There will never be another Bernie Sanders on the political scene. And there will never be another Bob Dylan. These are unavailable to us. So the question I have from this discussion and going back 30 years into this very intense, within the battle book, is traumatic for me in certain ways. And it raises questions that I didn't really realize I was discussing in some level, now are clearer to me, but the answers remain unclear. And that may be for others to work through. Also, this indigenous prophetic, very controversial. And this refusal of assimilation, the ultimate sense of being against idolatry. Yeah, the refusal of assimilation, but Jews need to be empowered. And what does that mean about assimilation to injustice? And are we really a community, a religious community like other religious communities? I would say yes, and know that there's something specific about being Jewish. What is that specific? What is it? The indigenous prophetic, what does that mean? And what does that mean for how we should live? So Beyond Innocence and Redemption raises a lot of these questions, often without articulating them in the way I would articulate them today. But going back through it as we are raises them for me.